And then the final thing for chapter 1 is he goes into his first vision. He says, he again refers to himself as John. He says, I, John, your brother, who share with you distress, the kingdom, and the endurance we all have in Jesus, found myself on the island called Patmos because I proclaimed God's word and gave testimony to Jesus. Again, real basic. Simply says, you know who I am. It's John. He's also very reticent about saying, like, he doesn't describe why he's there or anything else other than it's because of his faith. But just so you know, Patmos was a penal colony located about 60 miles in the ocean away from Ephesus. And it was where Romans would send high influence prisoners. And you would live in exile there with one guard living with you the whole time. And that guard would be switched out every week. But you'd always have this constant guard with you. So he doesn't tell us exactly what he did to get there, the circumstances, right? All the things we'd love to know more of. He simply says, I'm here because of my faith. I was testifying, and so on. He doesn't tell us why Peter and Paul are executed and he's only exiled. Although I've heard from Joe, it's because they couldn't kill him. Right, Joe? When you say they couldn't burn him? Yeah, you.
Yes.
So at least a tradition of the church has that. But he's here in this place, and he shares with them, he names 3 things: the distress, the kingdom, and the endurance. This gives us, again, another highlight of what's coming. He shares their distress, just like every other Christian. He's going to experience the same time of tribulation that Christ prophesies as they are. Right? It's beginning right now, and he's going to be part of it as well. He has the kingdom, because the church will be born in its fullness, and the reign of God will begin once the old order is finally out of the way. Right? Up to this time, it's been hindered, because right now you have the Eucharist being celebrated by some people, and then you have some people still claiming God is worshipped at the temple. So something has to give. And so he's telling us, now with what's coming, the kingdom will finally be beginning. And then the endurance, and you hear this from, it'll even come through the book of Revelation, but Jesus, a lot says, he who endures to the end will be saved. Right? You have to be faithful unto death, or whatever it is, either to see yourself through it faithfully, or even if it asks for your death in this great tribulation that's coming. So John explains he's part of the same thing that all of them are going to be part of. Then in verse 10, he explains very briefly at this point the same experience he has as Paul, but he explains it in much more detail, much more vividly. Paul just gives us these little bits, right? I was caught up to heaven. I was caught up to paradise. I heard ineffable things. There was an angel who beat me, But very brief. John says, I was caught up in spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a voice as loud as a trumpet, which said, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So immediately after being caught up, like Paul was caught up and experiencing the, quote, revelations, as Paul says, John suddenly hears behind him someone speaking with a voice as loud as a trumpet. What's reminiscent here is the experience of Israel at Sinai. When God appeared on Sinai, the people heard God's voice as if it was thunder. But Moses heard it as an ongoing blast of the trumpet. Or we say trumpet, the shofar, the ram's horn that Jews blow. So he hears the shofar, or the man's voice is like a shofar, so it's like the voice of God. And he turns to see who's speaking to him. This is another part just to keep in mind for later. God, throughout the Old and New Testament, his appearance, his visitations are often accompanied by a trumpet or trumpets. And trumpets had 2 functions in the Israelite world, which are very related, but to our minds they're not. So we'll look at it as we go through, especially when we get to the 7 trumpets. But the one you used a trumpet for was a call to worship. And Jews today, right? They blow the shofar at certain holidays to begin worship. The shofar is a worship thing. But the trumpet, same exact trumpet, the shofar is also used for warfare. To assemble, just like we did in the Civil War and everything else, you have the trumpeter, and that's the directions that all the troops, in this case Israel, knew how to gather into its companies when the trumpet blasted. So there's this connection between worship and warfare, and it's not accidental. Right? The first place you see it really powerful is Jericho. Jericho, they carry the ark around in worship for 7 days, and on the 7th day, the 7 priests blow it, crashing the walls, and then Israel invades. So there's this connection, and it's important because that's going to be a big connection throughout the book of Revelation. In fact, one of the whole sets of 7 is going to be the trumpets. We're going to have 7 letters today. Then we'll have 7 seals of a book, 7 trumpets, and 7 chalices. So there's this pattern of 7s. So he hears the trumpet, and then he looks behind him. First he's told to write on a scroll, singular word, scroll. That may not seem like a big deal, but it's important because it tells us a couple of things. One, the book of Revelation, from the prologue to the epilogue, is one book. It's not supposed to be divided up. The letters are not separate from the rest of it. It's all part of it. It's one scroll that he writes on. If anyone's interested, it's 14 feet long. And that's not unusual in the ancient world. So we know because people have written it out in Greek to see how long would it be. So I don't have that kind of time. But anyway, some people. The other thing, he's told, right to the 7th. The other thing it tells us is this. All 7 churches read the accounts of the other 6 churches. In other words, they get all the letters at once. It's one book. So everyone knows where other churches are doing well, what communities, and which ones are doing poorly. So that they can be warned or exhorted, act more like this church, or pray for each other, right? And send assistance or help, because we are all one communion. So it may seem like not a big deal, but when John says write a single scroll, write on a scroll, he's actually making something, an important idea. Let's cover one more thing and then we'll take our break. He says, I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 gold lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man. Notice the verse again, son of man, like the one who came on the clouds of heaven and everything, what Jesus referred to himself as, wearing an ankle-length robe with a gold sash around his chest. The hair of his head was as white white wool or as snow. His eyes were like a fiery flame. His feet were like polished brass refined in a furnace. His voice was like the sound of rushing water. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and a sharp 2-edged sword came out of his mouth. With his face it shone like the brightness. So you get this really weird description, right? Everything that John tells us, though, is reminiscent again of Old Testament prophecies. In a sense, we could truly say that John is the last prophet because he gathers together all of the Old Testament prophets, Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, Amos, all of them, and uses the imagery from all of them to come up with one successive story. So we see these images are all from the Old Testament. Now, everything Jesus is described as wearing or possessing characteristic-wise tells us about his identity. So the long robe, the chiton, is that would be worn by a priest, the long linen robe. The fact that he has the gold sash around his chest is indicative of kingship. So he's a priest and a king, just like he's going to make us priests and kings. Then his clothing inside, or his body, the hair as white as snow or wool, stands for his eternity. His fiery flaming eyes is his omniscience. He sees all things. His powerful feet like polished brass in a furnace is his omnipotent strength and firmness. And his voice, like the sound of rushing waters, is his powerful and creative word. Most of the imagery comes from one prophet, Daniel. But what's interesting is that what John does is, or what Jesus does, is Jesus is viewed in terms of what the prophet Daniel saw when the prophet Daniel saw two different people. God the Father. If you go back and looked at that story that we mentioned, he's coming on the clouds and he met the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days has white hair and wool and all. Comes from God the Father. And then the weird stuff like his polished brass legs and everything are Daniel's description of the angel Gabriel. So Christ is described as a mixture of both angelic and divine images, as well as the human images of being a priest and a king and all that. So let's go ahead and take our break, and then we'll come back, and we'll be able to start go through the 7 churches pretty quickly. The last 2 things John mentions about Jesus, we already mentioned. He's holding 7 stars in his right hand, and he has the sharp 2-edged sword that came out of his mouth with his shining his face. So the sharp 2-edged sword is a symbol of his absolute and irresistible power that's pronounce and execute judgment. That is the whole story of Revelation, is God's covenant judgment on apostate Israel, and also his forming the new covenant with the inheritor of Israel, the new Israel, the church. So it's a very, you'll see the image a lot throughout the book, but it's interesting that he sees him like that right from the beginning, so John knows something serious is up. His face shining like the sun in its brightness is that image of his radiance, of his divinity, and it also recalls the transfiguration, which John witnessed, is one of the 3 who actually saw that Jesus had during his earthly life. Now, he's standing in the midst of the 7 lampstands, the menorah. And it's kind of an interesting image because it sort of means Jesus is himself the root of the tree of life, the trunk. Because the menorah would normally be 7 branches, and that's what they called them, branches coming from a central tree. And so Jesus is sitting in the middle of the 7 of them, as if he is itself the image that he is the tree of life, right? The Eucharist, etc., things like that. He holds the 7 stars in his right hand, and for once, and the only time in the whole book, Jesus himself tells us what it means. So, if you go to verse 20, the last verse of chapter 1, he says, "This is the secret meaning of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand and of the 7 gold lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." So he stands in the midst of the churches as their source of life, and in his hand, he holds, in the right hand being the sign of comfort and power and such, he rules over the angelic hosts and the ones that have been assigned to guardianship of these churches. Right? This is why Catholic churches name themselves after saints and angels, is because what John sees, and where each church has their own guardian angel that looks over them. So that's where that imagery, that tradition comes from. Now, what is John's experience when this happens? He falls down on his face as if he's going to die. Right? He's terrified of death. Goes back all the way to the Old Testament, right? Moses was afraid to look at God. To look upon God is to die. It tells us that the glorified, risen Christ is not like the earthly Christ. He doesn't appear in any way normal, right? He is powerful. He exudes it from everything, so much so that his closest friend on earth, the beloved disciple, throws himself down in fear that he's going to be annihilated just looking upon him. Jesus touches him, again with his right hand, the sign of comfort and strength. And like you always see in these revelations, do not be afraid. Right? That's the first thing he almost always, any angel or anything, whenever God or an angel appears in the Bible, almost always the first thing they say is, fear not, or do not be afraid, whatever the translation you have. It was the first words of John Paul II's pontificate. If you remember that, I was young. That was the first big Catholic thing I remember, even more than my first communion. I think I was 7 or 8. And I remember I was at my grandma's house in Del Mar, and they just had it on the normal TV. And I was just like entranced by the papal, him becoming Pope. I didn't even know exactly what the Pope was at 7. But he came out, I still remember, he came out with the flag, all over the place, yelling out, don't be afraid. So just an image I've always kept. But Jesus tells us don't be afraid. I'll give you a side note from spiritual direction. And that is, we often get it backwards how God, or what is called the good spirit, which is either God or his angels and saints, and the bad spirit, which is the world, the flesh, and the devil, operate on us as people. The devil operates where the first experience of him is pleasure. It feels good. And then you slowly find yourself enslaved. God, every time in the Bible, when you read the real prophets and people like John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Bonaventure, who had these mystical experiences, the first experience, a real experience of God, a powerful one, is fear. Because there is nothing else in this world that can come close to what it's like to experience even the tiniest glimmer of infinity, before which you are literally nothing. Okay? St. Catherine of Siena had a very specific one. She felt as if God was holding her, or she saw a finger or a hand with a ring, and in the ring had all these facets, and one facet of the one ring of the hand that she couldn't even see the extent of had the entire creation within it. And she suddenly felt herself like she was caught up, like they do, and like Paul more so than John, she felt scrutinized, she says. She felt like she was being turned and looked at from every direction at once. And what God said to her is very interesting before he starts her visions. He says, I am he who is, you are she who is not. Because apart from God, we literally are nothing. Right? So John's experience is actually very common for people who have that kind of experience. I'm not talking about you have something nice in prayer or something. I'm talking about a powerful mystical experience. God comes as fear because you have that experience, the first touch of him, but then it quickly sort of develops into this peace and this security. Whereas the devil's the exact opposite. It comes as pleasure that slowly ropes you in and tries to entangle you. So he has this experience, and Jesus says, don't be afraid. And now he identifies himself again. He says, I'm the first and the last, the one who lives. So he's now connecting himself to what God the Father said. God the Father said, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus says, I'm the first and the last. But he adds the idea, the one who lives. Once I was dead, but now I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and the netherworld. So the suffering Christ has overcome the wounds inflicted upon him, the death inflicted upon him, so that they have no lasting impact. Right? He has passed through death and conquered it, and because of that, he now has the absolute power over eternal life and death. He holds the, quote, keys to the netherworld, to open them up and free all those who are trapped there, or lock those up who have no place anymore in his creation. Then we've already we looked at what he's supposed to record.